In the early 1400s, China commanded the largest fleets on Earth. Its ships dwarfed anything Europe could build. Its sailors crossed oceans no one else dared to map. And then, in a single decision made behind palace walls, China chose to stop, not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded. That night, the world quietly changed course. Near the early 15th century, while much of the world still measured distance by rumor and fear, China already knew what lay beyond the horizon. Its ships had crossed seas that most civilizations still imagined as the edge of the earth. Its sailors had followed the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean, past Southeast Asia, past India, past Arabia, and down the eastern coast of Africa. In the harbors of distant lands, people watched with a mixture of awe and terror as floating cities appeared from the mist. Ships, so large they seemed unreal, carrying silk banners, lacquered hulls, and crews that spoke for an emperor most had never heard of. This was not exploration driven by desperation or exile. This was confidence made wood and sail. And then, suddenly, it stopped. To understand how shocking that moment truly was, we have to let go of the world as we know it and step into a time when China was not reacting to global forces but shaping them. In the year 1400, China was the most powerful, most populous, and most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. The Ming dynasty ruled over more than 100 million people. Its cities dwarfed anything in Europe. Its bureaucracy was vast, literate, and deeply rooted in centuries of imperial tradition. Paper money circulated widely. Blast furnaces produced iron at scales unmatched elsewhere. Printing spread ideas across provinces. And at the center of it all sat the emperor, not merely a king, but the son of heaven, whose mandate to rule was believed to be cosmic in origin. This was a world that did not feel small, it felt complete. When the Ming dynasty came to power, in 1368, it did so by overthrowing the Mongol Yuan dynasty, foreign rulers who had dominated China for nearly a century. The trauma of Mongol rule lingered deeply in Chinese political memory. The Ming founders were determined to restore Han Chinese governance, stability, and moral order. They rebuilt institutions, reinforced borders, and reasserted Confucian values that emphasize hierarchy, restraint, and harmony. Yet despite this inward-looking philosophy, the early Ming emperors did not close themselves off from the world. In fact, they did the opposite. The Yongle emperor, who seized the throne in a brutal civil war in 1402, understood power not just as control over land, but as recognition beyond it. His reign was ambitious, forceful, and expansive. He moved the capital to Beijing, constructed the Forbidden City, and launched military campaigns deep into Mongolia and Vietnam. But his most extraordinary project did not march across land. It sailed. Beginning in 1405, Yongle ordered the creation of a fleet unlike anything the world had ever seen. Hundreds of ships were constructed in massive state shipyards along the Yangtze River. At their center were the so-called treasure ships, colossal vessels that dwarfed European caravels by comparison. Even conservative estimates place them at over 60 meters long, with multiple decks, watertight, compartments, and crews numbering in the hundreds. Some accounts suggest they were even larger. Whether or not those numbers were exaggerated, the truth remains undeniable. This was the largest naval expedition ever launched by a pre-industrial state. Commanding this armada was Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch who had risen through the imperial court with absolute loyalty to the emperor. Zheng He was not an explorer in the modern sense. He was an envoy of imperial will. His mission was not to discover new lands, but to remind the known world who stood at its center. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 major voyages across the Indian Ocean. The fleet visited dozens of ports, from present-day Vietnam and Indonesia to India, Persia, Arabia, and East Africa. They brought silk, porcelain, and gifts of staggering luxury. In return, they received tribute, exotic animals, spices, precious stones and symbolic submission. Rulers knelt, envoys bowed. The Ming emperor's authority was acknowledged in distant courts. And here is the critical point. These voyages were successful by every measure the Ming state cared about. They were not lost expeditions. They did not fail economically. They did not provoke disaster. They achieved their political purpose perfectly. China demonstrated its supremacy without conquest. The seas bent, briefly, to imperial order, which makes what happened next so difficult to explain. After the death of the Yongle Emperor in 1424, the tone of the Ming court began to shift. His successors were not conquerors. They were administrators. Men shaped not by war, but by the Confucian scholar official class. A powerful bureaucracy that viewed the world through the lens of moral order, agricultural stability, and historical precedent. To them, the voyages represented something deeply unsettling. The scholar officials did not see glory in the oceans. They saw cost. They saw distraction. They saw a dangerous imbalance between the state and the natural order. Confucian ideology placed farmers above merchants, land above trade, stability above expansion. The sea, unpredictable and uncontrollable, symbolized chaos. Wealth acquired abroad threatened the carefully calibrated hierarchy at home. Foreign influence was not a benefit. It was a risk. At the same time, threats were mounting closer to home. The northern borders were never quiet. Mongol tribes still roamed the steppe, and memories of foreign domination remained raw. Defending the land frontiers required enormous resources. Grain had to be stored. Garrisons had to be supplied. Walls had to be repaired. Every ship built for the ocean was timber not used for fortifications. Every sailor was a laborer, not farming the land. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, priorities changed. By the 1430s, court factions hostile to the voyages gained influence. Records were altered. Funding was cut. Shipyards were dismantled. Construction of large ocean-going vessels was quietly prohibited. Maritime trade was restricted, then criminalized. The state did not announce its retreat with fanfare. There was no dramatic declaration. No moment when China declared itself closed to the world. Instead, there was a night, or rather, a decision made behind closed doors, when the future of the oceans was surrendered without a battle. The treasure fleets returned from their final voyage in 1433. Zheng He died shortly after. No successor was appointed. The ships were left to rot. Some were burned. Others were dismantled for parts. Maps were locked away or destroyed. Within a generation, it was as if the voyages had never happened at all. China did not fall. It did not collapse. It simply turned inward. For the people living through this transition, the change may not have felt dramatic. Life continued. Crops were planted. Exams were taken. Taxes were collected. The empire still stood, vast and powerful. But history does not always change with noise. Sometimes it changes with silence. As China withdrew from the seas, a vacuum opened. No one in the Ming court believed mattered. Beyond the horizon, small European kingdoms were beginning to experiment with navigation, driven not by confidence but by desperation. They lacked China's technology, its wealth, its manpower, but they had something else. No alternative. Portugal, Spain, and later the Dutch and English did not sail because it was elegant or harmonious. They sailed because they had to. Blocked by land routes, controlled by powerful empires, hungry for spices and silver. They turned to the ocean as a gamble. Their ships were crude. Their mortality rates were horrific. Many voyages failed, but they kept going. By the time European ships began appearing regularly in the Indian Ocean, in the late 15th century, China was no longer there to meet them. The harbors that had once welcomed treasure fleets now dealt with foreign traders on unequal terms. The world China had briefly unified through tribute, fragmented into competing commercial networks. Control shifted, slowly at first, then decisively. The Ming dynasty would endure for 2 more centuries. It would not fall because it abandoned the seas. But the world it helped create would move on without it. When European powers later returned to China's shores, armed with cannons, gunboats, and demands, they would arrive not as distant admirers, but as challengers. All of this traces back to that quiet moment when the greatest naval power on Earth chose restraint over expansion, order over uncertainty, and tradition over possibility. And the question that lingers is not whether China was wrong. History rarely offers such simple judgments, but whether the world we inhabit today would exist at all if that decision had gone the other way. Ming court believed it had chosen stability, but stability is rarely static. It demands constant maintenance. And over time, the very systems designed to preserve order began to harden into constraints. By turning inward, the empire did not freeze history in place. It merely narrowed the paths through which it could respond to change. The sea was now something to be controlled, not explored. Merchants were regulated, then distrusted. Coastal communities were monitored, sometimes relocated inland, as if proximity to the ocean itself carried moral danger. Maritime knowledge, once celebrated, became suspicious. Navigation manuals disappeared from circulation. Shipbuilding expertise declined, not through collapse, but through neglect. This shift did not happen because China feared the outside world. On the contrary, the Ming worldview assumed China was the world. Foreign lands existed at the periphery of civilization, useful for tribute but unnecessary for survival. Confucian scholars argued that a well-ordered empire needed nothing beyond its borders. Wealth came from the soil, not the sea. Harmony came from hierarchy, not movement. In this framework, overseas ambition was not progress, it was imbalance. Yet beyond the carefully regulated borders of the Ming state, the world was entering a period of violent acceleration. In Europe, the 15th century was an age of pressure. Population recovery after the Black Death strained resources. Rival kingdoms competed constantly, and access to Eastern luxury goods, spices, silk, porcelain, became both an economic necessity and a political obsession. When land routes were blocked or taxed by powerful intermediaries, Europeans did not have the luxury of turning inward. They had to find another way. Portugal was the first to commit fully to the gamble of the sea. Its coastline faced the Atlantic, a body of water China had never needed to conquer. Portuguese sailors pushed south along the African coast, mapping currents, experimenting with ship design, learning how to survive storms rather than avoid them. These were not grand imperial missions backed by overwhelming power. They were fragile. Expeditions where failure meant death, and failure was common. Ships vanished. Crews starved. Entire ventures collapsed into silence. But unlike the Ming court, European rulers interpreted failure not as a sign to stop, but as proof that success lay just beyond the next attempt. Incremental progress replaced ceremonial display. Navigation became a science of survival rather than prestige. By the time Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, nearly 70 years after, China's last treasure fleet returned home, the Indian Ocean had changed. The rules China once set through ritual and hierarchy were replaced by force, contracts, and cannons. European ships were smaller, but they were armed. They did not seek tribute. They sought leverage. China watched these developments from a distance, confident in its internal strength. The Ming economy thrived through agriculture and internal trade. Urban centers like Nanjing and Beijing remained global giants. From within the empire, there was little evidence that retreat from the seas had been a mistake. But power is not only measured by what an empire controls, it is measured by what it can respond to. As European networks expanded, they rewired global trade. Silver from the Americas flowed into Asia, reshaping economies. Maritime choke points became centers of influence. Control of shipping lanes meant control of wealth. China remained a crucial destination in this system, but it was no longer the architect. It had been a node rather than a director. Internally, the Ming state grew more rigid. Bureaucratic procedures multiplied. Innovation slowed. Corruption spread quietly through the ranks. When crises emerged, floods, famines, rebellions, the empire struggled to adapt. Resources were vast, but flexibility was limited. The Confucian ideal of stability had produced a system optimized for continuity, not disruption. By the 16th century, coastal piracy became a serious problem. Ironically, many of these pirates were Chinese merchants forced into illegality by maritime bans. Smuggling networks flourished. Local officials often colluded, undermining central authority. The state's attempt to control the sea had not eliminated maritime activity. It had merely pushed it beyond the law. And still, the memory of Zheng He's voyages faded further into obscurity. European observers who encountered China during this period were often struck by the contrast. Here was a civilization of immense sophistication, technological brilliance, and administrative depth, yet strangely hesitant on the global stage. They mistook restraint for weakness. Over time, that misunderstanding would harden into arrogance. When the Ming dynasty finally collapsed in the mid-17th century, it was not due to European pressure. Internal rebellion, fiscal exhaustion, and natural disaster did the work. The Qing dynasty that followed would inherit both China's strengths and its strategic blind spots. The sea remained secondary. The world beyond remained distant. Centuries later, when industrialized powers returned with steamships and artillery, China would face a reality it had not shaped and could not easily resist. The Opium Wars were not caused by one decision in the 15th century, but the imbalance they exposed had deep roots. The night China chose isolation did not doom it, but it narrowed the margin for error in a rapidly changing world. History is often written as a contest between those who advance and those who fall behind. But the Ming story resists such simplicity. China did not retreat because it was afraid. It retreated because it believed it had reached equilibrium. It believed the world beyond its borders was already known, already ordered, already subordinate. That belief held until it didn't. And in that space, between confidence and surprise, the modern world began to take shape. What makes the Ming decision so haunting is not that it was irrational, but that it was internally coherent. From within the logic of the empire, retreating from the seas felt like maturity rather than loss. Confucian philosophy did not reward expansion for its own sake. It valued balance, continuity, and moral clarity. Power was meant to radiate outward naturally from a well-ordered center, not be chased across unpredictable waters. To the scholar officials who dominated the court, the treasure fleets were not symbols of strength, but dangerous exceptions. Extravagant gestures that disrupted the equilibrium between ruler, land, and people. The emperor sat at the apex of a moral universe. Heaven granted him authority, so long as he maintained harmony below. Floods, famines, and unrest were not random disasters. They were warnings, signs that the mandate of heaven was in jeopardy. In this worldview, excessive ambition was not admirable. It was reckless. When court debates turned against maritime expansion, they were framed not as questions of profit or prestige, but of cosmic responsibility. Zheng He himself embodied this tension. As a eunuch, he represented a class viewed with deep suspicion by the Confucian elite. Eunuchs operated close to the emperor, outside the examination system that defined bureaucratic legitimacy. Their rise often signaled imbalance. To many officials, the treasure fleets were not just expensive. They were politically dangerous, empowering figures who threatened the moral order of the state. Ending the voyages was as much about restoring ideological purity as it was about saving resources. This internal struggle was invisible to the outside world. Foreign rulers who had bowed to Ming envoys never understood why the visit stopped. Tribute missions dwindled. Diplomatic channels closed. The ceremonial world China had constructed dissolved quietly, leaving confusion in its wake. No announcement was made. No explanation offered. The empire simply withdrew its presence. Meanwhile, Europe's presence grew louder. As European ships established fortified ports across the Indian Ocean, they reshaped relationships through coercion rather than ceremony. Cannons replaced ritual. Contracts replaced tribute. Trade became competitive, violent, and transactional. Where China had sought acknowledgement, Europeans demanded compliance. The ocean transformed from a shared space into a contested one. China observed this transformation from afar, interpreting it through its own conceptual lens. European aggression was seen as barbaric behavior at the fringes of civilization, not a sign of a shifting global order. The Ming worldview struggled to recognize a system that did not revolve around moral hierarchy. The idea that small, distant states could project power across oceans and dictate terms to established civilization seemed absurd. And yet, slowly, the evidence accumulated. European traders brought silver in unprecedented quantities. Chinese demand for silver as a tax medium drew the empire into a global economy. It did not control. Wealth flowed inward, but influence did not. Dependency replaced dominance. The sea, once a stage for imperial confidence, became a conduit for external pressure. Within China, debates over maritime policy never fully disappeared. Some officials argued for reopening trade, for rebuilding fleets, for engaging the changing world, but institutional inertia prevailed. The risks of change felt greater than the risks of continuity. The past, idealized and selectively remembered, became a guide for the future. Stability was preserved at the cost of adaptability. This pattern repeated across generations. Each decision, reasonable in isolation, compounded over time. Knowledge faded, skills atrophied, strategic imagination narrowed. When crises emerged, responses were reactive rather than proactive. The empire endured, but it did not evolve at the pace of the world beyond its shores. What is often misunderstood is that China's retreat was not a rejection of progress, but a different definition of it. Progress meant moral refinement, bureaucratic excellence, agricultural productivity. These goals were achieved. Living standards improved. Literacy spread. Art and culture flourished. From within, the empire seemed successful. But history does not measure success by internal coherence alone. It measures it by interaction. By the 18th century, when European envoys arrived, demanding equal diplomatic status and expanded trade, they encountered a court still operating on assumptions formed centuries earlier. The Qing dynasty, heirs to Ming institutions, saw no reason to treat foreign powers as peers. The system had worked before. Why change it now? The answer arrived not in words, but in gunfire. The shock of confrontation revealed a gap not just in technology, but in worldview. The sea, once a symbol of disorder to be controlled or ignored, had become the primary arena of global power. China had not been absent. It had been waiting, and the world had moved on without it. The night China chose isolation did not seal its fate, but it shaped the conditions under which later choices would be made. It defined what seemed reasonable, what felt dangerous, and what appeared unnecessary. It narrowed the imagination of an empire that had once stood confidently at the center of the known world. History rarely punishes a single decision. It amplifies patterns. And the pattern China set in the 15th century echoed forward, not as decline, but as delay, a pause that allowed others to accelerate past. Modern historians often wrestle with the temptation to frame the Ming decision as a tragic mistake, a single turning point where China surrendered the future to Europe. But this interpretation says more about modern assumptions than about the 15th century itself. From the Ming perspective, there was no looming European challenge, no visible global race, no sense that dominance of the seas would determine the shape of centuries to come. The world China inhabited was vast, slow-moving, and deeply hierarchical. Change happened across generations, not lifetimes. In such a world, restraint felt wiser than risk. The treasure fleets had projected overwhelming power, but they had also revealed an uncomfortable truth. Power could be mobile. Influence could drift beyond borders. Wealth could circulate outside the control of the state. These were not abstract fears. They struck at the heart of imperial legitimacy. A ruler whose authority depended on order could not easily embrace systems that thrived on uncertainty. The ocean did not respect hierarchy. Storms did not acknowledge rank. Distance diluted command. To the Ming state, the sea represented a domain where imperial control weakened, not strengthened. And so the empire chose land. Land could be taxed. Land could be measured. Land could be defended with walls and armies. Land rewarded continuity. The agricultural heartland fed the population, funded the bureaucracy, and anchored the moral economy. Confucian scholars believed sustained civilization itself. In choosing to prioritize land over sea, the Ming were not rejecting ambition. They were redefining it. For generations, this choice appeared justified. China remained prosperous. Its culture radiated influence across East Asia. Korea, Japan, and Vietnam absorbed Chinese writing, philosophy, and governance models. The empire's internal coherence outlasted many European states that tore themselves apart through war and religious conflict. From within, China looked stable, while Europe looked chaotic. But stability has a hidden cost. It resists transformation, even when transformation becomes necessary. As global systems tightened, as trade networks expanded, and military technology evolved, the advantages of maritime power multiplied. Control of oceans meant control of supply chains, information, and force projection. Empires that mastered these dynamics could act far beyond their borders. Those that did not found themselves reacting to events they did not initiate. China's late encounter with this reality was not due to ignorance. It was due to timing. By the time the implications of maritime dominance became unavoidable, the institutional foundations required to compete had eroded. Shipyards were gone. Naval traditions were fragmented. Strategic thinking had turned inward for centuries. Rebuilding from that position was possible, but costly, disruptive, and politically dangerous. When European powers arrived with demands rather than tribute, the shock was profound. It was not merely that they were aggressive. It was that they refused to recognize the rules China had lived by for millennia. They did not see the emperor as the son of heaven. They did not accept symbolic submission. They did not want harmony. They wanted access. The resulting conflicts of the 19th century are often framed as inevitable clashes between tradition and modernity. But inevitability is a retrospective illusion. What made these encounters so destabilizing was not China's weakness, but its mismatch with the system it was forced to enter. The world had reorganized around oceans, contracts, and industrial power. China had organized itself around land, ritual, and continuity. And yet, the Ming decision should not be read solely as loss. There is another interpretation, quieter but equally important. By turning inward, China preserved itself through centuries of turmoil that shattered other civilizations. It avoided the relentless cycle of colonial expansion, exploitation, and overseas warfare that drained European states even as it enriched them. It maintained a cultural core that survived conquest, rebellion, and regime change. History does not reward or punish choices, it reveals their trade-offs. The night China chose isolation was not a failure of vision. It was a commitment to a different vision of civilization, one that valued endurance over expansion, balance over dominance, and moral order over global reach. That vision shaped East Asia for centuries. It defined how China understood itself and its place in the world. Only later, when the global system hardened around different values, did the limits of that choice become clear. Today, as China once again looks outward, investing in trade routes, naval power, and global influence, echoes of that earlier decision remain. The memory of withdrawal, of vulnerability, of missed influence still informs modern strategy. History has not repeated itself, but it has left a long shadow. The story of China's retreat from the seas is not a cautionary tale about fear or failure. It is a reminder that power is contextual. What strengthens a civilization in one era may constrain it in another. The future is not lost in a single night, but it can be quietly redirected. And the history is filled with empires that collapsed under pressure, shattered by enemies they could not repel or systems they could not sustain. The Ming dynasty faced no such immediate threat when it chose isolation. There was no invading armada on its shores, no economic catastrophe forcing retreat, no technological rival demanding urgency. The choice was deliberate, reasoned, and confident. And that is precisely why it mattered. When an empire retreats in fear, it leaves behind evidence of weakness. When it retreats in confidence, it leaves behind something far more dangerous: absence. An empty space where influence once existed, a silence that others eventually fill. The oceans did not remain neutral after China withdrew. They did not preserve the ceremonial order the Ming had briefly imposed. Instead, they became arenas of competition, violence, and relentless experimentation. Where China had sought acknowledgement, others sought control. Where China had valued balance, others embraced risk. The seas rewarded those willing to endure failure again and again, until success reshaped the rules. China's worldview, shaped by millennia of continuity, had never needed to think this way. Its strength had always come from endurance, rather than acceleration. Dynasties rose and fell, but civilization remained. Borders shifted, but culture endured. From that perspective, the chaos of maritime expansion looked temporary, even crude. Why chase the horizon when the center already held? But the horizon did not stay distant. By the time the consequences of global maritime dominance became undeniable, the world had hardened around new norms. Power traveled faster. Wealth concentrated differently. Technology advanced unevenly. The systems China had perfected for stability were suddenly out of sync with the environment they operated in. Not wrong, simply misaligned. The night China chose isolation did not doom it to humiliation or decline. What it did was shape the tempo at which China could respond. When the world demanded speed, it traded flexibility for resilience, adaptability for coherence. For centuries, that trade-off worked. Then, abruptly, it didn't. And yet, even this is not the end of the story. History is not linear. It loops, reframes, and revisits old questions under new conditions. In the modern era, China has returned to the seas, cautiously, deliberately, and with memory. Trade routes stretch outward once more, fleets patrol distant waters. Influence flows along corridors both ancient and new. The ocean is no longer seen as disorder, but as opportunity. Still, the lesson of that earlier choice remains embedded in strategic thinking. Power must be controlled, not scattered. Expansion must serve stability, not undermine it. The memory of withdrawal tempers ambition. The past whispers caution even as the future invites reach. The story of China's isolation is often told as a tragedy of missed potential, but it can also be understood as something far rarer, a civilization choosing to define success on its own terms, even when the world was beginning to change its rules. That choice carried costs. It also carried continuity. Few societies have survived so long with their core identity intact. The world we live in today, shaped by oceans crossed, borders breached, and empires projected outward, was not inevitable. It emerged because one civilization stepped back, and others stepped forward. History turned not with a battle, but with restraint. And perhaps most unsettling truth is this: had that decision went the other way, had China remained on the seas, the modern world might not recognize itself at all. If you want to understand how single decisions quietly redirect centuries, how confidence can be as powerful as conquest, and how history's loudest consequences often begin in silence, then stay with this channel. Subscribe and explore the moments when the world almost took a different path, because those moments still shape the one we're living in now.